Um, Before pivoting to the Q&A, I invite the panelists now to all come online, as it were. So that we can grace the assembled audience with our presence. I'm an outsider by profession, as I said, however connected by background and my enthusiasm for the papers here. My thanks to Neeti Nair for inviting me to moderate this session. My thanks to the panelists for just wonderful papers from which I have learned so much. And may I also say, I think this is the first time I've ever been involved in any panel that has been on time. I would recommend this to any other organizer, that perhaps the gender dynamics are ideal. And it's just wonderful to be a part of something like this. Thank you. I want to leave space for questions. We have some, but I would like to make a comment on all the papers. I'd originally prepared specific questions for each of the papers, but mindful of time, I'd like to just make a general comment if I could. What I take from the papers as a whole, and I hope this is useful for our audience as well, I don't know that it will be, is this twinned question: where is the work of imagination found, and what does such work demand of us? Uttara's work asked us to rethink the connection between partition as a concept and territoriality. For language can become a key way to articulate what belonging to a collective and a collectively recognizable group can involve when one does not have a region to identify with. For them, she says, language for the Sindhi community became the fulcrum around which a sociocultural identity could be regenerated, end quote. And language can be, as one Kashmiri put it in the 1950s, where we dwell. But then where is this kind of language at issue in collective modes of resistance, belonging, memory, and articulation found? Shahla drew from intercepted letters, and I quote, pamphlets and poetry, fascinatingly enough, and the paper revealed the irrelevance of the artificial borders in the Kashmiri psyche, and given their desire to challenge and to transgress the divides imagined and made real for them, and beyond the constraints and restrictions of a militarized, God, how militarized landscape. Note how this counterpointed Athar's sense of the work of placemaking in poetry and the sense of poetry given where it can be found. The state's making of place in such a terribly, terribly real sense can shape the imagination, but no less than the imagination shapes the places and modes of belonging we have available to us. So Shahla's method, all the papers really, underscore themes raised and made explicit in Athar's work, keeping in mind what Athar elsewhere has called ethnographic poetry and extending it to keep in view the poetry that spills out from one's work in the field or archives, and the poetry found, as it were, when one works with people and in archives, and keeping in view the way emotions, experiences, and perceptions enter into the most surprising recorded forms and are excluded in many ways from the forms we transmit, recognize, articulate, and make available to others. The point is, how do we take stock of the human ways of imaginative shaping we come across in our work? How do we train ourselves or sensitize ourselves to take stock of such work? Hussein wisely tells us to go beyond national political imaginaries when talking about people. And Uttara tells us that language, and not alone territory, is important. And Athar's work raises the general question: is there an ethics of attention to language then, to counterpoint the borders imposed on our imagination and our identifications? How does one listen, Athar asks, to poems and songs if one is not supposed to record them or hear or read them ever again? How does one comprehend the losses in the poems and the losses of the poems, I want to say? And how does one learn to hear what is happening in them? I hear Meher Faruqi ask us. She says, and I quote, if we read carefully, we become aware that from the beginning, everything is in the past. The present is only to help understand the past from a different perspective, and with new experiences. Thus, and I'm skipping a bit, the present too can be a discovery of the past, end quote. Meher is own writerly sense of attention to what can happen in a narrative is rather different from the modes of temporal attention and the modalities they reveal, found in some characters of Basti, right? The kind of fatalism that would have the repetition of history play out as increasingly more infelicitous ways. And that opens up the question, can there be future possibilities based on reconsiderations or discoveries of the past made by scholars as well as readers of the archives and people they encounter? Is what we are doing as scholars something like reconstructing omens of the past, which give us intimations of futures that are only virtually but not really present yet? And how many distinctive hermeneutic and existential modes of collecting and learning to attend to the work of imagination and language are there? And are we passive or active with respect to the meanings of time and history then? What are the norms for our patterns of attention and memory? That's a fascinating series of questions for us all to take away, I think. At least I will have to think about it a lot harder than I have. This is particularly when I would love to just be able to sit around, have some chai with all of you and be in real time and carry on conversations with a dynamic and a flow. I do hope, inshallah, one day that you guys are all in Charlottesville and this particular pandemic is over and we can chat. Uttara, with your permission, do you mind if I thread a question to Athar right after this? It'll flow better. But like the speed skater who wanted Sindh to be replaced by Kashmir in the national anthem, I don't want this to be a case of Sindh not getting its due. I owe this to your work, so I would not have known about it. But I'll bring in Athar now for the next question from Eric Beverly, who says, thanks for this wonderful presentation, Athar, and is intrigued by your use of the word settler colonialism in connection with Kashmir, or with post-colonial Kashmir, and asks if you could say a little bit more about the history of, if we could discuss the history of colonialism at any scale, whether because of nation or state or what have you, over a longer period in Kashmir, and what insights that might have for South Asian regimes of power.
This is another simple question. It's a very simple question. So the use of word settler colonialism, I think, what happens is I'm talking in terms of Indian administered or Indian controlled or Indian held or Indian occupied. There's like numerous vocabularies that you can use to understand Kashmir. And if you look at the human rights the United Nations documents, it is referred to in varying vocabulary, but mostly administered. That kind of gives you an idea of how to look at Kashmir, so to speak, on both sides of the ceasefire line. I think, and for this, I think to answer this question and to understand the full impact of this question, you also have to alter your vantage of India a little bit, because, India really, when you look at from the Western vantage and the kind of narrative that India has woven in the last 72 years, even thinking about what Chela was talking about earlier, the history, the political history and the history of India and Pakistan forming as two nations, what happens to Kashmir at that very moment, and thinking about Kashmir and thinking about the Kashmiris inside and what they wanted at that particular moment. We can talk a lot about that, but thinking about India, so to speak, as not a benevolent actor, not coming to save Kashmiris, but actually being the aggressor. And that's what a lot of historians and what Kashmiri critical scholars and historians, as you've heard earlier, have also tried to kind of prove that India is not a benevolent actor in here. It is a colonial power. It might be itself in this ailment of post-coloniality, but at the same time, it is a neo-colonial power when you look at from a Kashmiri vantage. And I think that becomes very important for us to see what India has made visible and to what it has made invisible since 1947 for the rest of the world. And in that, you have so much happening inside Kashmir that is not told. And that's how we, like you, someone was asking Shela about intergenerational trauma. I think we are also symbolics of that trauma. I think three people here, literally, Sonam, Shela, and me, of course, all of us in many ways, but thinking about Kashmir specifically, just trying to understand our own history. I think now, I mean, I want to speak for me personally, and I can also speak for Shella because you used to say share the same bench in the Urdu class. We didn't know anything about Jammu massacre. We didn't know about them. I mean, we think about it's subsumed under the partition violence, which is not the right way to look at it. And I think excavating all of those little and big realities around the formation of India and Pakistan, I feel that kind of lends you a vantage into looking at Kashmir and thinking about settler colonialism per se. I know a lot of people have trouble when they think India, they can't really think settler colonialism, but change your lens a little because you have to start looking at the heart of India, especially through the eyes of Kashmiris and Kashmir. And I think in that, what happens is that suddenly you see an army that comes in and annexes in 1947, and there's like lots of literature that helps you see what was actually happening inside Kashmir at that moment, who wanted what, and what were the Pakistan military, can we call it full-fledged Pakistan military in that particular moment in time? Who were the raiders that the India kind of like projects? Were the raiders so-called the raiders, and do all Kashmiris respond to that vocabulary? Or do some of them see them as, protectors and, saviors? Because at that very moment, another thing that India had mobilized, and when we think about India, we think about BJP since 2014 or BJP since 1991 maybe, but that's not the true case. The case is that in 1947 itself, RSS had a big role to play in the massacre that took place in Jammu of Muslims. And I'm not saying only Muslims were massacred during that violence, but more than 200,000 Muslims were massacred. Many fled to what is now Pakistan. And that massacre is invisibilized. And why is it that invisibilized? Because that kind of lends to the narrative of what India shows the rest of the world, that it kind of saved Kashmiris. But the truth is that it changed the demography of Jammu in case that plebiscite was happening. And RSS had a huge role to play in that entire machinations that the monarch at that time did. So you can approach this question of, I don't know if Kashmir is post-colonial. I feel like it's a neo-colonial element. It's a neo-imperialist vision that you can see of India when you look at Kashmir. So in that sense, post-coloniality is, of course, it's ongoing, but settler colonialism of Kashmir is not something of a misnomer. So you see people fleeing in that moment from Jammu, getting killed, demography changing from 60%, you have less than 40% of Muslims. So that was kind of, again, engineering done to influence plebiscite, if that ever happened. Then the other thing is what people do not see that remains completely invisibilized. What happened in the 50s in Kashmir? What happened in the 60s? What happened in the 70s? What happened in the 80s? When Shella talks about collaboration, you can also use the word client politicians for Sheikh Abdullah that Shella talked about earlier. This was a hugely visionary guy. He was seen as the father of the nation, but he was also very myopic when it came to India. But he realized this within the first 3 years itself, how dangerous India was. And he was actually seeing the Jammu pogrom. He was seeing what India had done. But then he was deposed right after, when he kind of like began to think about that and began to, be jarred, because a lot of women during that time, Kashmiri women, they were, including a daughter of one of the leaders, she was first kidnapped and then she was raped, much like the stories that happened around partition violence. But that violence is really specific to Kashmir. So what happens in the 50s is also very important when you think about India, because India kind of like touts itself the biggest democracy, which it is not, especially when it comes to Kashmir. Thinking about the electoral politics inside Kashmir, which is usually propagated as a symbol of democracy, but that is just politics, because the elections that were held inside Kashmir in 1951, essentially for governance of this territory, because it is a disputed region, that was considered as out of order by United Nations, and it said as much. But India at that time again said that it's perfectly fine because we're doing this for governance. And it was also considering what was won by the Azad Kashmiris at that time, the other territory. So, if you think about the 50s, 60s, 70s, you see different phases, and you see this colonial constitutionalism, you see this occupational constitutionalism taking over, which is kind of like India uses courts, India uses everything that is at its disposal, client politicians. And in every decade, it takes client politicians, installs them, and in the next decade they're gone. And that's what we see happening since 2019. A set of client politicians that it had installed, they're gone now. They have gone out of favor, and now you have another set coming in. So essentially, to understand the history of colonialism through the eyes of Kashmiris, and to understand settler colonialism inside Kashmir, Indian settler colonialism, you really have to shift the vantage. You have to look at India from a neo-colonial perspective rather than a post-colonial nation for Kashmiris. I don't know how the equation looks for the entire thing, but I am speaking strictly from a Kashmiri vantage.
I think we have, if Neeti will allow us, 15 minutes, and I think we can use that to get in. Excellent. In that case, so what's going to happen now, I'll ask one question, I'll pose one question to Uttara, and then one for Meher, and then there's one question that we have received for the whole panel. And I think it'll be nice if we end with that. If that's okay. That means I might have to drop a couple of questions for each of you, but this way we'll get one in each. Okay, Uttara, this one's for you. Yeah, you get three Kashmiris together, it's a real danger. Talk about internal colonialism. The conversation's not going to go very far, but
like
we're gonna exert some discipline. Okay,
it's
so
most of displacement. It's okay. I like being with them. So,
so here's the question. It takes us back in time. Uthar asks, can you please explain Congress attempts to get minorities to voluntarily surrender their separate electorates before or after the 1935 Government of India Act? The Pune Pact, Uthar suggests, appears to have been the only successful push in this direction prior to the 1950 Constitution.
Yeah, so the Pune Pact successful in terms of Gandhi bullying Ambedkar to give up the idea of separate electorates for the depressed castes. But there's also the question of separate electorates for religious minorities, particularly Muslims. And this question becomes a hot potato in the late 1920s because the British have announced that they're going to make a new constitution for India earlier than they had planned, which sort of comes into being in 1935. And so various Indian political formations are sort of quickly get together to sort of discuss what they want from these constitutional arrangements. And Jinnah, he's not wedded to the idea of separate electorates. This is an old argument by Aisha Jalal that he's more interested in power sharing arrangement at the center. And so he calls a meeting of Muslim representatives of the Legislative Assembly and persuades them to agree to the Delhi Muslim proposals in 1927, which proposes, in essence, the creation of three new Muslim majority provinces in exchange for giving up separate electorates. Which are these three provinces? Sindh, the Northwest Frontier Province, and Balochistan. And as it happens, the 1935 Act only separates Sindh. Balochistan and the NWFP have different provisions, the different constitutional provisions for them. So this is actually quite a significant moment in the history of partition because it's the question of territorializing minority rights. And but I think scholars seem to have missed this part that they've somehow just overlooked that he's proposing an exchange here, that that we'll have these Muslim majority provinces in exchange for giving up separate electorates. But then the Nehru report, which is like a Congress dominated report in 1928, wants to accept this. And so in principle it accepts this idea that we should have what are so-called communally defined provinces then, but it says that this should come into being, this change of arrangements should come into being when India has its own constitution, and so that So then Jinnah rejects the Nehru report because he would find it difficult to bring his own, the provincial Muslim leaders on board with this, that when the constitution of India, when it has dominion status, comes into being, then we'll have these provinces. So, but this is actually a key moment when both linguistic and religious belonging is sort of attached to territory, even though these territorial arrangements then happen, say, in 1947 and 1956 in India with the linguistic states. And these discussions very much sort of fertilize each other. They're not separate discussions. And so it does call into question some arguments about the diasporic nature of Muslim nationalism and the foundation of Pakistan, but we don't have time to go into that here now, I think.
Thank you so much, Uttara. There have been some follow-up. Can the panelists see the Q&A? There is a follow-up from Eric, actually, and I would like to, I'll read this out and I'll let the panelists decide if they want to follow this up in the chat. So granted that these terms colonialism and imperialism are insufficient, as India and other states are by no means post-colonial forms of power, but does the important work that you are all doing help us think about processes prior to 1947 and the ostensible time of decolonization, like, which would look very different when viewed from places like Kashmir or beyond Kashmir? And so I'll invite you guys to think about this and to follow it up. There is one, I know I'm breaking my own rules here, but this seems like a very quick question asking for specific information. How does one access Madhosh Palami's work? And I'll let Atar take that up if there is an easy answer with Masumi in the chat.
So
But
he does have 2 volumes of poetry that have already been published, but they might not be available online. It will be in Kashmir. I'm trying to get some for myself as well. So if that becomes available, it would be easy for us to share. But there is something that has been done. There's some multimedia work that has been done in the past 2 years. So there's a few links that I can just drop in here, where he's reading his poems, and it's like short episodic movie clips, like a series. So that might help get you started. So yeah, I'll drop that in the messages.
Actually, I would love to see that too. That's amazing. Thank you, Atar. Okay, so a question for Meher now, from Dhananjay Kapsi. It's 2 questions. I'm going to ask the first part of that, and then I'll ask another question. I think it's inspired by Meher's talk for the whole panel. So the question for you, Meher, is, do you think that the post-Intizar Hussain generation of writers and readers in Pakistan, so post-1947, born and brought up post-1947, have any interest in a syncretic civilizational view of the subcontinent? Meher, you're still muted.
Yeah, sorry. So yes, thank you for this question. I think it's an incredibly important question. But I want to remind you that Intizar Hussain passed away in January 2016. So it's not been such a long time since he's left us. And he has a huge following of, I mean, he is in a class by himself, you know. I mean, I've looked at him from the modernist perspective, but he didn't really identify himself with the modernist movement in Urdu literature. He kind of was his own person who was using Hijrat as aesthetic to understand the civilizational receptacles that had been shattered through migration, and also, I mean, listening to Uttara talking about Sindhi, I was getting some insights into language as this important thread that keeps you connected to the cultural roots. And so Intizar Hussein's quest was constantly finding, I wouldn't even call it syncretic. I think syncretic is too small a word to describe what Intizar Hussain does. I think syncretism is not, it's too superficial. It's something that, Bombay cinema does when you have the token character who's a Christian or a Muslim or something. Intizar Hussain represents a very deep understanding, if you may say, the of the essence of what it means to belong to to a civilization which has so many layers to it. And in his stories, he has this grand sweep which begins with, sometimes with the Buddha, sometimes with the myths of creation. Sometimes he has this idyllic world. So to get back to the question, I really cannot answer it directly, but I do feel that as long as there is modernistic writing in Urdu, it is always connected. So modernism in Urdu is essentially a means of connecting with the past. It's very different from what we could see it from a Western lens. Modernism is not distinct from classicism. Modernism is just a way of just as Intizar says, that the present is sort of a way of being connected with the past, because the past is always in the present. So I don't know if I'm making sense here, but I would thoroughly, I would really recommend reading Basti. I read it myself a while ago, and then I read it again for writing this paper, and I had a much better understanding of what Intizar Hussain was trying to do in Basti, because it's so full of symbolism. And the Basharat thing, which is probably an answer to your question, an omen, something that happens in tumultuous times, something that is a part of all religions. The Masiha will come, the Mahdi will come, the Kalki will come, so all of these things, that there will be something that will somehow bring some kind of resolution to this dilemma of Asho in which we are at the moment. So I am pretty much, reading a lot of contemporary Urdu literature, and I don't think there's anyone who writes like Intizar Hussain presently. But that doesn't mean that Intizar Hussain is not being read, or that Intizar Hussain doesn't still influence Urdu writers. So it's a very sort of roundabout way of answering the question.
That was lovely. I actually am really struck by the idea of modernism being
Yes.
to the sense of the past. Actually, I think this will set us up for our final question, which again I think was really triggered by Mayor's paper, and then has taken into account the whole panel from Tarun Saint. For all the panelists, are the concepts of post-memory, as in Hirsch's work, and post-amnesia especially resonant while revisiting the cultural production emanating from the regional locations dealt with in the individual papers? And I'll invite you all to jump in as you see fit.
Such a good question.
Really, it's a big one. You have all attracted very simple questions, and direct, and the kind that we could take years. Is there a way to invite someone to
start,
or to even for Tarun Sen to speak, or I don't think that can work in a webinar, but we could leave it as a question, as a suggestive question, to help tie together some of the papers. And Uttara, there was another question for you that I can send to you, or make available in the chat. It was a delightful question about the Sindhis who did not come to India, who stayed behind, became Pakistan.
Do you want me to answer it now?
No, not necessarily. We are at the end of time, but I was just going to say that you can.
I have typed something in the chat. But
Oh, very nice. Thank you.
If it's adequate.
Thank you. Is there, I wanted to let the panelists and or Niti have the last word. I think it was such a.
I don't know if I mean, I could briefly like talk to the idea of like thinking about post memory and, you know, in my work, just quickly, I don't know. Like,
Please, and then you'll give us a nice way to wrap it up.
So, so are these questions like helpful to, or are they resonant? I think they are resonant because earlier there was a question about intergenerational or, you know, traumas and, you know, thinking about sort of these amnesias or post amnesias, and all of these paradigms are helpful. They are resonant. I think in my work, earlier work on disappearances, especially enforced disappearances, to just look at so there's this disappearance of a disappearance by the state, that technically there is no one has disappeared. And then you have, you know, you have all these people who are actually trying to tell the world that someone has been disappeared, but they have no proof. They have, so I kind of mentioned that a little bit in my paper. So we do that kind of labor in trying to establish how these, one, they speak to sort of like intergenerationally to the memories of older people and to ones who are coming. So I feel in that sense they are especially resonant. But thinking about the cultural production in Kashmir at this moment, I think my paper did speak to that in some measure. So that's where I'd leave it at, that they are helpful and they do help us look at the politics of memory. And earlier I talked about affective law. I think that's one of the ways where one looks at post memory. You know, I have this example of a young girl who has never seen her father, and she was 1 year old when her father passed, when he was disappeared by the Indian Army. She has never seen him, but there's this, and I kind of like take the idea of post memory also through Gabi Schwab's work, where she kind of talks about the Holocaust, and then she talks about memories and post memory in Germany. And this is a young girl who has never seen her father, but the way she kind of takes further the struggle that her mother and her grandmother are going through. So what actually happened once was she was drawing a picture in which she draws a house with 3 doors, and it's and when the therapist asks her, why are you drawing 3 doors, she kind of like, the door kind of is the idea of waiting, and there's like 3 doors where 3 people are waiting, but she doesn't really say it, but she kind of like tries to convey that these are 3 people waiting at, so it was like 3 waitings, like her mother, her grandmother, and herself. So in that sense, like if you deploy those vantages, it does help in some ways to understand how the struggle is going on, how the struggle for memory and memorialization is going on, and how affect is kind of the ideal here, which is helping some sort of cultural resistance. I'm not trying to glorify these tragedies, but it does kind of give you that kind of cultural mooring. And just to think that today in Kashmir, while politics is there's so much hegemony, that even today, like this morning, journalists are being asked to not go to the encounter sites, the similar site like Balhami's house, to report. So what do you do in that situation? How does the resistance move forward? And I think that's where the cultural resistance comes in, that's where these vantages help us. And as we say that it's in the DNA of Kashmiris, resistance has become very cultural. It is political, but it's also cultural, which is why it's so hard to erase for India. And it's taken it 72 years, and I think it will take it more 100 years if it goes on like this, but it's never going to go away. I don't know if I answered it in the manner the person wanted, but I just wanted to speak to it a bit.
I could take a stab at it through Intizar Hussain and his idea of time. I just sort of this excerpt, this quote that everything was so new yet everything looked so old. That sort of has the key to how experience helps us develop this post memory. You know, we look at something and it is then it is then perceived through the present and the past memory, and then it sort of creates this new perception. So why does he say that everything is so new but it looks so old? I mean, I think it's all to do with civilizational memory and the fact that time is always running and it's never static. And so there's no such thing as stopping time. And I mean, if you look at it through the lens of the ghazal, it transcends time. If you read something that was written in the 12th century now, it seems like it was just written for you at this moment. So I guess this is a question for a philosopher really to answer. I mean, we can just try to give it some more thought and definitely come back to it one more time.
Thank you so much, Meher. I think that's a good note on which to conclude. It's been a really thought-provoking set of papers. Thank you to all the panelists, and a very special thank you to Sonam Kachru for moderating the second session. Thank you so much. Michael will say a word about the recording of this session, of these sessions. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Niti, and thank you to everyone who's taken part in this symposium today. It really has been terrific, and I would just echo what many on the chat channel have been saying, that the quality of the presentations we've had today have been really excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And on behalf of the Royal Society of Asian Affairs, we are delighted to have been able to help sponsor and run this event. As Niti alluded, recordings of today's event will be available in the next few days on the RSAA YouTube channel and via the RSAA website. And articles based on the talks given today will in due course be published in a special edition of the RSAA journal Asian Affairs, which is available both in print and in downloadable form. And we will let you know when that becomes available. For now, though, thank you on behalf of the RSAA very much indeed.